place, I looked for a second-hand bookshop. And I tried to find something I'm interested in. And a number of years ago, I saw this book, and it intrigued me. So I got it off the shelf, and it tells me it's titled Modern Poultry Farming. Well, I must admit, it didn't immediately grab me, because I'm not really into poultry farming. And just to check, I thought I'd read the index, and it told me the chapter headings. It didn't grab me even further. Things like poultry house construction, poultry diseases. And I should think there'd be many here, in fact almost everyone, if not everyone here, would react as I did. You'd think, well, fine, I've got nothing against poultry farmers. You might even say one of your best friends is a poultry farmer. I doubt it. But it's not for you. But just suppose there was someone here who would say, I am a poultry farmer, this is just the kind of thing I'm fascinated by. Let me tell you that this book, which is entitled Modern Poultry Farming, was actually published in 1944. A better title for it would be Ancient Poultry Farming. So something narrows the field. It's only of use to those who are interested in how poultry farmers used a poultry farm 60 years ago. It's irrelevant and out of date and fit for nothing but the bin. And that's where it's gone. A book like that is worthy of the bin, unless you're fascinated by a very obscure piece of information. Well, I've got another book here. It's a book that every one of you have got on your chairs. It's entitled Uncover, in this version at least, but it's got a much older title. It's Luke's Gospel. And it may be during the last few days a kind friend was rather nervously knocked on your door and said, look, we've got this series of events coming up called Love, and we're trying to encourage people to read this book. Would you be interested in reading it? And because you're nice, you didn't just immediately shut the door, and maybe you smiled, and maybe you accepted the Bible. But then your friend went away, and I wonder what happened to it. I've no doubt that around Oxford there are many copies of this little book, attractively produced as it is, once people open it up and discover that despite the packaging, it is frankly a very old book indeed, called Luke's Gospel. There are many bins around Oxford that have received this little booklet, and the others. Perhaps wondering, I've got it, will I actually read it? Will I chuck it in the bin once my friend won't notice? I'm too polite to do it for the next few weeks, but it'll sit there and then eventually it'll gravitate towards the bin. If you're in that category, this book is for you. I'm imagining someone who's saying, look, convince me why I should be bothered not to put this in the bin, but actually read it and engage with it myself. There'd be many, of course, who would say this book is irrelevant to them. And they might say, some of my best friends are Christians, and nothing against Christians, I'm just not into that kind of thing. It's irrelevant to me. If that's you, I want to suggest, and I'm speaking, of course, as a Christian, that's a big mistake. Because the Christian claim is that this book is not about some irrelevant bit of information. It actually contains, the Christian claim is, the key to life itself. And that key is not some deep philosophical theory, it's a person. Jesus of Nazareth. It's okay, that happened so long ago. It's outdated. Again, the Christian claim is, no it's not. The Christian claim is not only the ideas of this man, but his life and death and resurrection, we believe he still lives today, has life-changing impact. But I'm not expecting you at the beginning of this talk, or even at the end, to agree with me. I'm just saying the Christian claim is this is profoundly important. And it's not simply the ideas in this book that are important. Buddhism is a set of ideas. Whether the Buddha actually existed is irrelevant. I think he did. But it's irrelevant. Buddhism is about the ideas of Buddhism, but it matters very much whether Jesus Christ actually existed. He's not just giving us his ideas. Christianity is about the life and death and claimed resurrection of a man. And every one of those things is important, not just his ideas. It's because he really lived. He really died. He really rose, as Christians believe. That he can offer the gift of forgiveness and friendship with God. Life, meaning, purpose to those who trust in him. Now you might not believe in all that. But I'm saying everything hinges on history. Did he really exist? Did he really live such an amazing life? Did he die a sacrificial death? Did he really rise? And those historical questions bring us straight back to a book like this. Because the evidence is found supremely in what we know as Christians as the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And this is one of them, Luke's Gospel. The Born Loved Week is unashamedly about Jesus of Nazareth. You'll find every evening Greek Times will be speaking from Luke's Gospel about Jesus of Nazareth. And it may be you're saying, well, before I engage with that, I need to know, is this worth taking seriously as an historical document? What are you chucking it in? I want to suggest to you, yes. You've got a bit of white paper somewhere on your seats, headed Why Trust the Bible, and we're really homing in on the Gospels and especially on this Gospel, Luke's Gospel. Can we trust him? And I'm trying to address very briefly in evidence, and forgive me, it's bound to be superficial, and please feel free to come back to me afterwards with a bit of depth if you want to. I'm trying to address what I think are the four main objections that I hear. That people say, here are reasons why I don't want to take it seriously. Objection number one, these Gospels, and this Gospel of Luke in particular, is just a collection of myths. Here's Richard Dawkins in his famous book. He said the Gospels have the status of legends, as factually dubious as the stories of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. Good, nice stories, but cannot be taken seriously as history. And I want to say a big but to that. The highly contentious claim that I don't know any serious scholar of the New Testament would put things, even those who are quite sceptical, would put things anything like as strongly as Richard Dawkins. And I want to go to the other end and say, this is a very serious historical document that can be taken seriously. For a start, that's what it claims to be. It presents itself as a historical document, not a collection of myths. We'll come back to the beginning of the Gospel in a moment, but just take hold of the uncover book, which, as I say, is just Luke's Gospel. And turn to page 20. Page 20 is the beginning of chapter 3, and here is one of a number of references I could turn to that just shows you, in passing, Luke wants us to know he's talking about things that have really existed in real-time history. Luke chapter 3, verse 1, page 20. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John. He could not make it more clear. He's saying, what I'm about to tell you, I'm rooting in real-time history. And here are the significant people who were involved in government power and religious power at that time. It's suggesting very clearly it wants to be taken seriously as a historical document. More than that, the Gospels claim not just to be historical documents, but based on eyewitness evidence. Matthew's Gospel, very early Christian tradition, just comes from Levi, the tax collector, also known as Matthew, who was converted. Mark, for instance, most scholars would say Mark was the very earliest Gospel, and early Christian tradition from the early second century, Papias, the early Christian writer, says that Mark wrote down the recollections of Peter. What about Luke? Luke was not an eyewitness of Jesus himself. The very earliest Christian tradition, which goes right back to the early 2nd century and has never been contested, there's no alternative tradition as to who wrote this Gospel, says it was Luke who wrote it. Nowhere in this document itself does it say who wrote it. It says who it's written to. Luke 1 verse 4 says this was written for a man called Theophilus to convince himself about the truth of the Christian faith. But very early Christian tradition says it came from Luke. And Luke, we know from one of Paul's letters, was a doctor. He's referred to in Paul's letter to Colossians as our dear friend Luke, the doctor. He actually wrote two documents which are found in our New Testament, which would have originally been bound together in one scroll, Luke and Acts. There are four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then the book of Acts gives us the early history of the very early church straight after Jesus left this earth. And Luke wrote a Gospel the account of Jesus, and then is evidence about the very first Christians. Luke Acts is one document. And halfway through the book of Acts, there's a very interesting shift. Luke has been written about events that are kind of out there, and then suddenly, in Luke chapter 16, verse 10, he refers to we. Very interesting shift. And from then on, as he describes Paul's travels, he says, we went here, we went there. And I don't know of any other satisfactory explanation of that than to say he was travelling with Paul at this point. That was in Troas in modern Turkey. And then he still talks about we as they travelled together to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, was where Jesus finished his ministry, where he died. Where there would have been many who witnessed Jesus' quite public pronouncements towards the end of his life. There were many eyewitnesses there. And Luke is claiming to get his material from eyewitnesses. And there I've written down for you, and you can check it out, it's in this document, the very beginning of Luke's Gospel, which is as clear as a claim as could be found to be writing serious history. Just look at it. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that are being fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account in you most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. It's a very clear claim to be basing what he writes on eyewitness testimony. The fascinating book written by Richard Vaughan, the New Testament scholar, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which has really had a big impact in New Testament scholarship. And even quite sceptical scholars are taking much, much more seriously the very clear claim of the New Testament Gospels not to be written a long time after the event on the basis of what had just been handed down over quite a long period of time. They were writing eyewitness testimony. And at the heart of that are the 12 apostles. It's interesting, Luke here talks about those who from the first were eyewitnesses. And that was what was essential for an apostle. Someone who's witnessed Jesus' ministry from the very beginning of his public ministry until his resurrection. And that is the foundation testimony of all the Gospels, including Luke. But then Luke adds other eyewitnesses as well. No doubt, eyewitnesses that he himself had met when he went to Jerusalem. And they're named. Look, for instance, at page 54. Here are some women. And that's worth noticing in passing, by the way, that they were women, because in the ancient world, sadly, the testimony of women was not taken very seriously. In a court of law, discounted the testimony of women. So if you were inventing a gospel and you wanted to get the very best testimony, you wouldn't invent the testimony of women. That's just a reality. And yet Luke refers to the witness of women because they gave witness to him. He mentions by name, Luke chapter 8, the end of verse 1, the 12, they were the foundation witnesses, were with him, and also some women who had been cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, the manager of Herod's household. Susanna, and many others. Very specific, isn't it? As if he's saying, if you want to check it out, here are the people. And he specifies exactly who the people are. And some of these women appear again at the very end of the Gospel. Page 158. This is Luke chapter 24 and verse 10, the evidence for the resurrection. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, only 11 now, because Judas had betrayed Jesus, and he's committed suicide. They told all these to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. Here are named eyewitnesses. Now it's striking that the Marys are called Mary Magdalene or Mary the mother of James. Why is that? Because there were lots of Marys about the time. Mary was a very common name. If your name is Jones in Wales, you'll probably be called Jones the postman, Jones the butcher, because there's so many Jones. And then there were lots of Marys. And so rather than just say Mary, it's Mary Magdalene, the Mary who comes from Magdala. Mary, the mother of Jesus. They were specific people who the first readers of Luke's Gospel, many of them would have known. That's where he got his material from. And Luke wrote these documents close to the event, in the lifetime of those who had actually seen it for themselves. Now, you cannot be sure exactly when the Gospels were written. Most scholars would say Mark's Gospel would be the earliest, early 60s probably, but you can't be sure. Best guess for Luke is round about 80 AD. You might say that sounds quite a long time after Jesus, because Jesus died probably about 33 AD. So we're talking quite a long time, aren't we? 33 to 80. Well, it might sound a long time to you. It doesn't to me. Because my maths tells me that's exactly 47 years. And that's a very short time. I'm 47. It takes you back to 1965 when I was born. And 1965 to me doesn't seem like a long time ago. The height of the Beatles. You start spreading new stories about the Beatles. Paul McCartney said, no, look, I was there. It didn't happen like that. And there have been many, many others who witnessed what was going on with the Beatles who said, I was there in the crowd. It didn't happen like that. And it's that towards the end of the lifetime of those who were actual eyewitnesses that this material began to be written down, preserved. The time when there were many around who could say it wasn't like that. I assumed when I first read the Gospels that they were myths. I began to read it when I was 17, the New Testament Gospels, because my sister got on with me. She'd become a Christian at university. She was a right pain. But I thought, I'll shut her up. I will investigate this. Without telling her, I began to read the Gospel, and I was shocked. Because I'd assumed it would just be mythological stories that you couldn't test, and yet it did not read like that. You read it for yourself. Take this document and read it. It has the ring of truth. All these historical details, in Luke and Acts, lots of them, that can be verified. And when tested against other ancient writings and archaeology, again and again and again, Luke, in his writings in Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts, is verified. I remember working in a library next to a distinguished-looking man who I discovered later was called Colin Heeman. Colin Heeman was a very distinguished classicist who decided to switch to New Testament studies, and his major life's work towards the end of his life was testing the reliability of the book of Acts. And he wrote a groundbreaking book exactly on this point. He called it the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. And again and again and again, point after point, Luke is shown to be a very accurate historian. I was in Cambridge, and quite straightforward in Cambridge, that the head of the college is called the master. You come to Oxford, it's much more complicated, because the heads of different colleges are called different names. And you can spot an Oxonian, they know that it's the Dean of Christ, the Rector of Exeter, the Provost of Oriel, the Master of Balliol. And you just naturally say those things, you know it. And as Luke records what happened around the ancient world, and Paul writing, he uses different names, that precisely write different names for the different officials in different places. In Acts 17, he reaches Thessalonica. He refers to the politarchs in Thessalonica. And some skeptical scholars at the end of the 19th century said, oh, well, there's evidence. Luke doesn't know what he's talking about. We've never come across any chief officials known as politarchs. And then inscriptions were found referring to the politarchs in Thessalonica. Not the real truth. Not least in the embarrassing details. There are lots of them. If you were inventing a story and twisting it, you would make sure that the great leaders of the early church would come out in a very good light, wouldn't you? You read this gospel. They don't come out in a good light. They are very slow to believe. At the great moment when Jesus is contemplating his death and he's in agony, thinking about what it will mean, and he's praying desperately to the Lord, what are the disciples doing? They're asleep. And when Jesus has been arrested and he's being undergoing a mockery of a trial, what's happening to Peter, who became the great leader of the early church? He's denying Jesus on 3 occasions. Embarrassing details. It's the collection of myths. objections I hear. Second, we can't trust such ancient documents. So, okay, let's concede, you might say, for a moment that they began as eyewitness documents, but how do we know that what we've got now is what was written then? How do we know they've not been doctored over time? And this is a very common theory. Dan Brown, in his book, The Da Vinci Code, gives a version of it. The kind of idea that Constantine, in the 4th century, invented Christianity. That the early Christians certainly didn't worship Jesus as God, and this was imposed by Constantine, and he suppressed lots and lots and lots of other ancient Gospels and just promoted these ones, and they were doctored as well. People read the Da Vinci Code and think they understand New Testament scholarship or ancient scholarship. They do not. It just didn't happen like that. The evidence is not there. Those 4 Gospels from the mid-2nd century, Irenaeus, the bishop of Lyon, he refers to these 4 Gospels as distinct and authoritative. And from the very earliest days of Christianity, the first documents we have in the New Testament are not the Gospels. They're the letters of the Apostle Paul. And it's quite clear that the Apostle Paul was worshipping Jesus as God from the very earliest stage. And these other Gospels, they're not nearly as many as Dan Brown talks about hundreds. Nothing like it. But there were other Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, that was discovered in the mid-20th century. But the best evidence, you can't be sure of dating, but most scholars would put that as the mid-2nd century. It's not a representative of authentic Christianity that's then been corrupted by the Gospels, quite the other way around. This comes out of Gnosticism, which is against the material world, which is a corruption of Christianity. As if the really spiritual people have no contact with material things. Whereas the Bible begins with the great declaration that God made everything. Very pro-matter and bodies. Jesus was born materially. This is corruption, rather than the other way around. And if you look at the manuscript evidence, it's very striking. There are many, many ancient manuscripts which show that the text of the New Testament has not significantly changed over time. Compare it with other ancient documents, and you can see the evidence down there. Caesar's Gallic War, written 58-50 BC. Oldest surviving copy, about 900 years later, and only about 10 copies. Compare that to the 4 Gospels. Oldest copy, much closer, 50 years or so. The number of copies, well, hundreds of complete copies. 5,000 ancient manuscripts, 24,000 if you include translations into other languages. There are many, many, many of them, and you can compare them. And when you compare them, you discover there are not significant changes. There's the odd word here, the odd word there. Homer's Iliad has 764 lines in depth. The New Testament only 40. That's a percentage inaccuracy of 0.5%. There are only 2 slightly longer sections of the New Testament, the end of Mark's Gospel and one little section of John's Gospel, that seem probably not to have been in the earliest manuscripts, but are in most New Testaments today. And neither contain significant doctrines that don't appear elsewhere. Now I want to suggest to you that this second objection doesn't work. What you've got in the Gospels is very, very substantially what was there at the beginning. Third objection. The authors were biased. I mean, how can we take seriously the evidence from Christians? Of course they would say Jesus is God because they were Christians. And so you can't take them seriously as historians. That seems to be based on a misunderstanding of history. All history is, in one sense, biased. What I mean by that is it's written from a perspective. You cannot not have a perspective. What is history? I mean, your history book of Oxford in 2011, what are you going to contain? How many things have happened in Oxford in 2011? Multiple things. So how are you going to select what you'll include in your history? Your perspective will influence that inevitably. And Christians chose in their Gospels to put the evidence that backed up what they believed to be the truth. So in one sense, all history is biased. The question is not, does it have an axe to grind, does it have an angle from which it views things, but does that distort the facts? That's question. When you can look at other ancient documents and find it's not only in the New Testament Gospels that you have reference to Jesus Christ. The Roman writers, Pliny, Tacitus, the Jewish writer Josephus, very interestingly and significantly, referring to Jesus as, I quote, a wise man, a teacher, a miracle worker. There's mention of the crucifixion, mention of the resurrection. We assume Josephus didn't believe in it, but he certainly recognized that many, many people did. And there it is, in an ancient document, AD 93. And then what about the lives of the early Christians? This to me is very convincing indeed. And you might say, if they've got something out of this new religion, then we'd be very suspicious of what they've written. Let's be honest, there is money to be made in religion. If you manage to promote a religion of Scientology, which is a philosophy, there's a lot of money made out of Scientology. If you can invent a religion and get status and money out of it, you're going to be very suspicious about the motives. But what happened to the early Christians? The first witnesses of Jesus of Nazareth and his resurrection, which is what they claim. They did not make money out of it. They suffered greatly. They were persecuted. A number of them were killed for their witness. Now that doesn't mean to say that what they said was true, but it convinces me that they really believed that what they said was true. And it all went back to the claim that Jesus had risen. And they were absolutely convinced that the tomb was empty and that they'd seen him. And those first disciples all claimed that they'd seen him. And something transferred those terrified individuals who were convinced that the next knock on the door would be the authorities out to get them as they'd killed Jesus. Something transformed them from being terrified into those who preached with such conviction that they turned the world upside down. And their message was, this Jesus, whom you crucified, God has raised, and we are witnesses. And then finally, I've only got a minute for this. Final objection. Oh, come on, we can't take these Gospels seriously because of the miracles. They're frankly unbelievable. Fair enough, in the ancient world, poor people then, they were pretty ignorant, they didn't know about science, and so they believed in this kind of stuff. But we live in a scientific age. We now know that these things don't happen. We understand the laws of nature. We cannot take these things seriously. To which I just want to say, careful. They're not as stupid as you think. They were not expecting dead people to rise every day. They knew that when you died, you stayed dead. And so often this objection against miracles is based not on the fact that we're in a scientific age, it's based on a philosophical presupposition that there is no God. And if there's no God, then of course there can be no miracles. And the laws of nature, which by definition are the usual way in which things work, always apply. But if there is a God, then surely the time when his Son visits the earth is one time when you might expect, if ever he's going to suspend the laws of nature, it might be there. And I'll leave it with this. No one in the ancient world at the time of Jesus questioned his miracles. No one said he didn't do these things. Even his own enemies acknowledged that. The debate was not about whether they happened or not, but what power gave him. Where did the power come from that enabled him to do it? And his enemies said, he's from the devil. And others said, look at this life. Listen to his teaching. This is not the devil. This is the loving power of God, inviting people to come to know him. You might not be convinced, but before you chuck this in the bin, I just urge you to read it for yourself. Talk with friends. Come in the evenings, as we'll be looking with Rupert Tice, at bits of this gospel. And what an opportunity it is, just to ask questions and make your own mind up. Thank you for listening.
First question. I'm going to have to go on here to do this. If there is evidence in the Bible, if the evidence in the Bible is so strong, why do the most intelligent people no longer believe it?
I don't think it's a question simply of intelligence. So you can't prove God, and there are plenty of intelligent people who believe in God, but plenty of intelligent people who don't believe in God. There's much more going on. And my frustration is not so much that loads and loads of people have carefully investigated the evidence and then with their minds said, I can't accept this. My frustration may be someone who's very intelligent, who spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and you just can't believe it. And I don't want to dismiss your questions at all, but my experience, and I've worked in Oxford for well over 20 years, is that most intelligent people in Oxford have actually never themselves read the evidence. And that's what we're talking about here. So it's not a question of lots of intelligent people carefully investigating the evidence and then most say, well, I don't believe that. It's, from my perspective, most people never really engage with it. And as I say, you may have done, and you've got a question, I want to take them very seriously. Come to the conversation. But my suggestion is most people never really engage with it. And once you do, then there are big issues, not just of the mind, and there are certainly some of the mind. I don't want to dismiss those. But there are an awful lot, there are issues of the will. Who's going to be God in my life? And if it's true that there's a God who made the world, who came down in the person of his Son, who's inviting us to come to believe in him, trust in him, be forgiven by him, and follow him, that's not only great news, it's very challenging news, because it means I'm no longer the centre of my life. So there's more at stake, I want to suggest to you, than simply rational looking at the evidence. But I wish more people did that.
Thank you, Vaughan. Can we flick up the second question, please? Is it true that the earliest version of Mark's Gospel doesn't mention the resurrection, but ends instead by reporting the empty tomb?
Very likely. So the end of Mark's Gospel is one of those two references that I referred to earlier. There are two longer chunks in what are normally there in the New Testament Gospels that don't seem to be there in the earliest manuscripts. And one of them is Mark. And it's a mystery. Mark's Gospel, if that's the case, and we can never be quite sure what was the original form, but if that's the case, it does seem to end very abruptly, and there are debates as to why that should be. But it's not because Jesus didn't believe in the resurrection. Mark didn't believe in the resurrection. I mean, the very early Christians all believed in the resurrection. And the empty tomb is the most powerful evidence for the resurrection. So it's an abrupt ending. It's a mystery why it ends so abruptly, if it did in the original form. But it's not an adequate explanation so Mark didn't believe it, because in which case the whole gospel ends very oddly. It's building up to the cross, and Mark again and again shows Jesus promising that he will die and then be raised. And then it records his death, and if Mark didn't actually believe in the resurrection, what's he doing writing everything else? Which is all moving to this climax in fulfillment of the prophecies Jesus himself made that he would die and rise. So, quite possibly. But if behind the question is the implication Mark didn't believe it, I would say, no, that doesn't work.
Cheers. Question. Oh, thank you. When did the gospel writers... Why did the gospel writers not write it down straight after the resurrection?
They were preaching it. And so from the very beginning, they got out and proclaimed this message, and they proclaimed the message as eyewitnesses. And we don't know who wrote things down. So it's interesting, if you read the beginning of Luke's Gospel, he says, many have undertaken to write down the things that have happened amongst us. And so it seems that there were earlier documents, and we can't be sure quite what they were. There's some clear literary relationship between, at the very least, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes known as the Synoptic Gospels. And most say Luke and Matthew had Mark's Gospel in front of them, and then they had other sources and so on. People talk about a few sources that maybe Luke had. But we just can't be sure what they had. It seems quite possible that there were written down collections of sayings of Jesus, written down collections of the deeds of Jesus. We don't know who wrote those down. But most of the time, they were getting out and proclaiming it. And the obvious time to really settle this and make sure it is written down is as they're dying. And that's when Luke's Gospel seems to have come into this particular form. Luke says, I've looked at all the evidence from eyewitnesses, and also, it seems, different documents, and I've given this orderly account. Because once they're dead and gone, you really do need, at that point, a written record to preserve the testimony of eyewitnesses. But with all these things, there's speculation, because we're talking about what we really don't know. What other written documents were there which then Luke relied on? We can't be sure. But that's my best guess.
Cheers. I'm coming down to this level, so in the Old Testament or Paul's teachings, can I trust them? Do I need to believe them?
Because I don't quite know, I can imagine what you might have in mind about the strange bits. And all I'm trying to do today is not convince you that the whole Bible is the very word of God. I believe that as a Christian. But that's not been my aim today. My aim today is to say this document can be taken seriously, historically. Come into this and engage with the person of Jesus, because what you find here is a real account which can be trusted of the real Jesus. That's all I'm about. Now, if you want to ask the bigger question about what about other bits of the Bible, I think they have to be dealt with in the detail. But personally, for me as a Christian, I take the whole Old Testament very seriously because Jesus did. But I come to these Gospels and I came to the conviction I couldn't explain it any other way than to say this is who he claimed to be, the divine Son of God. And he clearly took very seriously the Old Testament as the Word of God. He claimed to fulfill it all. And he prepared for what we know as the New Testament by setting apart apostles, those 12, and then specifically Paul, to be the apostle of the Gentiles, to speak authoritatively in his name. So it's on that basis that I take it seriously. But I'm not asking you to do that at this stage. You don't have to believe the whole Bible before you can believe in Jesus. You just need to, as it were, be convinced that this is worth taking seriously historically. And the starting point is not to get bogged down in lots of those details, but to think, what do I make of him? And then the other questions follow on. They're important questions. But I'd suggest don't start with them. Start with the person of Christ. But I appreciate if you've got particular questions in your mind, that would be frustrating as an answer. And feel free to come and ask me about those specifics if you want to.
Thanks for addressing that. Okay, the next one. Even if the Bible is mostly accurate, what makes you think it's more relevant and poultry farming? More relevant than poultry farming, ancient or modern?
I gathered some pointers in that direction. The Bible is not, and this document is not just giving us history for the sake of it. For some history books, just so it's worth recording what actually happened. There's no message, there's no implication it should change on the basis of it. It's just giving a record of what actually happened. It's actually very hard to categorize the New Testament Gospels. That they just don't fit into any other category of literature. So they're biography, they're about a person. They're history. They describe what actually happened. But you won't find them in the ancient world under the biography category or the history category. They invented a new category. Gospel. Gospel. Gospel means the proclamation of good news. In the ancient world, or news anyway, if a new emperor had been appointed, there'd be evangelists, the same word that was used, that would go out and evangelize, proclaim the news. There's a new emperor appointed. And what you've got here is proclamation. It's proclamation that matters. These early gospel writers and the early witnesses of Jesus weren't just saying, let me tell you about some interesting things that happened. But they're saying, this is life-changing message. Because this is God's yes to all the questions and confusion that came before. God made the world. It's part of the whole story of the Bible, which begins with creation. God made the world and everything in it. And then it's followed by mess, human beings turning away from God, and everything's in a mess. But then, despite the fact we've turned away from God, God loves us, and he wants to put things right, and he makes promises to a particular people, the Israelites. And he's saying, I'm going to bless you, Abraham's descendants, and through you I'm going to bless the whole world. I'm going to put things right again. I'm going to restore this broken world and make it possible for human beings to come back in relationship with me, and I'm going to do it supremely when my Christ, my Son, comes. That's where the whole Old Testament is pointing. And these gospel writers proclaim the great news that the moment you've been waiting for has happened. God is acting in the world again to put things right, to restore the mess, not just of individuals, that they might come back to know God, but to put everything right. And he's done it through his Son, Jesus. Now, you might think that's barking mad. But if it's true, it's not a mild interest. It's the most important news in the whole world. It matters.
We've got time for one more question, which is, what about the influence of translators? Isn't it more their word than the word of God?
Thank you. Translators clearly have an influence. You know that Muslims, Orthodox Muslims, don't translate the Quran. You've got to learn Arabic because it's come down and you can't go and translate it. Christians never had a problem with the fact that this needs to be applied to different cultures and you need to translate it to be able to do that. But of course, that gives influence, quite significant influence to translators. You can get it wrong. But the great news is that we're not just relying on the translations. We've got the originals. And so there's Hebrew, most of the Old Testament in Hebrew, Greek, the New Testament. And so it can be checked. We're very fortunate in English to have lots of different translations. And by and large, the translations are just, sometimes it's, oh, how do we get it? Could be that way, could be the other way. We're not talking about significant doctrine in mind, but you can check it. Which is why scholars and many pastors learn Greek and Hebrew to try and make sure that we're not distorting it. And so that limits the power translators have. If the original documents were locked up in libraries so that no one could see them, then the translators have huge power. But they're not locked up. And there are many people who know them and can question, is that an adequate translation? And so that limits their